2022 was a big year for me personally, and I can assume for many others. As you know, I've worked very hard on my catalog. I've released 21 albums. Obviously, some of those are extras and compilations and what have you, but I think it's still a pretty impressive number, and I would like to celebrate all the work that I've done over the year of 2022 in this year, where I will hopefully give all this hard work some appreciation and make better stuff, build on what I've done before. So, I'm going to get straight into this, and I'm going to be going over all of the main albums that I released over this year. Now, first, there will be some rules for this. Now, I won't be counting any compilation albums, so that leaves these off the table. So obviously not fair and doesn't really make sense for me to cover those. But yeah, that's really the only rule I have, and I'm going to be splitting everything into categories, which there are 6. The first category is the concept albums, the albums which I open up the year in. Basically very experimental stuff. The next album is Barriers, which is a series of albums which spanned March 2022 to September 2022. It consisted of 5 albums. One of them is an EP, one of them is an extras album, but still lots of stuff. The next category will be the unrelated to Barriers story albums, kind of a bit of a side thing, but yeah. The next category is the modern albums, which stems from September to recent day. I'll get into more of what that means, just like with concept albums and Barriers adjacent story albums, once I get to those categories. Next we have original music, which there are a couple, and I will go over those at the end. Compilation albums, which I will probably not be talking about at all. Alright, let's get into this. I never said that my discography had a steady start. The first album we're going to be looking at is Rapidly Fading Legacy and the alternate version, because they're effectively the same thing. This album was meant to tie into the themes of death, already tying into the absurd conceptual nature of what the concept albums kind of were. They were just like, oh, you take a concept and you try to make something with it. It was a bit of a challenge, if you will, kind of, and I proposed it as the beginning, but it just became sort of me trying to represent this idea, and in this it would be like, oh, what it's like to listen to music that's been released by people who have died, and obviously that's kind of like the main theme of the album, and then you have its secondary theme, which is connected to the sort of background of Billy Hill and the Optimists. At this early point, I was really trying to like sort of build up this band as being somewhat believable, somewhat real, and that's why on the cover you see like, oh, made with unused content from Come On and Join Us. Obviously that album does not exist yet, but maybe it will at one point, and it sort of like flushes out this idea of this album being made with pieces of other albums, or another album which you never see. And that obviously plays into the mystery of Billy Hill as a moniker, and obviously as a character. The track names sort of go into the sort of story of what could have happened to Mr. Hill at this time. Again, it was also very early, very much laying the groundwork for everything that came after it, and very experimental in nature. Would I say it's good? I would not say it's good, but it definitely set footing for everything that came after it. I would say it's a solid start as sort of portraying these concepts, but again, it didn't do it too well. But what I do think did well in terms of portraying its concept was the next album. Greatest Hits Collection was the next album released. It was also a very conceptual album, this one being a lot more direct in its themes, and that was the sort of concept for this one, is everything is from the same time period. because before everything was kind of all over the place. Like you have old songs and new songs, but they're all mixed together. But in this, you have like a sense of unity in the sources, but there's also a lot of difference because there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of different effects, a lot more experimentation was happening here, and that's great. This definitely laid the groundwork for everything that came up for it, even more than Rapidly Fitting Legacy, I would say, because one, it's got a lot of interesting sounds on it. Like, for example, Stuck Between that's such an interesting track. I've never been able to figure out how the hell I made it, and it's just such an amazing sound which I just keep using over and over again. And then the second thing I wanted to point out, which is so important about this album, is its themes to Billy Hill. This album is very important because it relates to the past and themes of like this band being real but long lost. But this is sort of like a greatest hits compilation, like looking back, even though it's not really that. I kind of like that it sort of pretends to be that, and it's definitely very interesting. It's not that good, and some of the tracks just aren't very interesting at all. But then you have like other tracks which sort of boost it up, tracks which really carry the album, I would say. Again, I'm going to mention Stuck Between Them. There's a lot of other interesting soundscapes which are created, especially on the alternate version with What Did They Say the Day Before You Went Missing, which is directly sampling Rapidly Fitting Legacy and also literally relates to the album's name, is got a special place in my heart. I don't think it's that good, but it's very nostalgic to me. It feels like fall. I don't know if that's just the cover, but this album is definitely very special. It's not good because of, I guess, the majority of tracks not being too interesting because there's lack of experience, but definitely lots of experimentation, and I commend it for that. As you can see, the concept albums were the place where I was finding my footing, building up the background to this band. The next category will be the Barriers category, the first album of which, Fiberglass and Flowers, I would also group into the concept albums, but I'll talk about it there. Just the main thing to keep in mind for the concept albums was that it was mainly finding footing, very conceptual in nature, and you'll see some more of that when I talk about Fiberglass, that there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of new ideas being presented. Fiberglass and Flowers, I would say, is ahead of its time. It's probably one of my favorites, even though I know it's not that good. Well, I say not that good in relation to what? I guess not that good in relation to my more modern stuff, which I view as better because more experience. But for the time, I would say it's amazing. It's way ahead of its time. It uses a lot of the experimentation that was done between the first two albums of the year and then everything before that. Again, building off everything I said earlier. This album's production was very different from the other albums. It started off as having 4 parts, and all these parts being like 20 plus minutes in length. Like only 3 of those parts still remain on my files. The other was lost to time, and lots of other content for the album was lost to time. Lots of the changes and growing pains it went through, but I think all these changes that it went through made it a better album. Like there's a lot of interesting sounds on there, like for example, like the beginning, Fiberglass and Flowers. It's an amazing song, probably the best on the album, and this style is repeated throughout other songs, especially everything else in the original 3 parts which still exist. Again, blending this modern piano sound with a very drony ambient style, being like layered with multiple voices, and it goes up and down and up and down. It goes all over the place. I love it. A lot of it is, again, nostalgic to me. It feels nice to listen back to in a way. Kind of strange to compare the new stuff to the old stuff. Again, back to the album. I think it's interesting. There's lots of different elements and sounds and themes at play. Like this was the first story album, and why I think it works so well with the story is because it wasn't made to fit the story. The story was put on after, and it was modeled around the music. And for some reason, I never did that again throughout the entire year. I was always making the music with the story in mind, even though in the more recent albums, like Where the Wind Blows Through You, it was sort of next to me, and I didn't try to wrangle the story around it because I saw how bad it affected the sound in the next albums, which I'll be going over. And here it works so well because it was just pure experimentation. I was just going wherever I wanted. I was just doing what sounded good. And I think the idea of chasing the sound rather than the story is what made it so good. I just did. And there wasn't really a method to the madness. Sometimes there was. Like, some tracks are very connected and like they were made at the same time, you can clearly tell. Like in the middle of the woods, the main piano drone sounds very similar to Running Down an Empty Road, and that's because they were made at the same time. And I really like this idea of reusing in this album. Like, it happens a lot. Like, apparently the same sample is pulled from Rust and Roses everywhere, but I don't believe that. But definitely the same samples are used in multiple places. Maybe not pulled from one track or the other, but definitely pulled like from a bigger source. And you see that happen like in other albums where there's like a longer track and I just take some parts of it, like Twilight and Thunderstorms. The whole like rain sound that you hear throughout the first part of it is from the same large file. And I really like this idea of reusing and sort of tying these stories together with music in a way that just doesn't really happen anymore, or that didn't really happen in the story albums coming after it. Because again, there was no story in mind. It was just, okay, I'll put this in here and it sounds good. I'll have a bit more elements of this. Lots of things which are very subtle, and you probably won't even notice on your first or second or even third listens to because it's very quiet or it's very faint or only plays like once throughout the entire song. And these small details I really love. But then you go from the sort of flowing and very creative, very fluid process of production from Fiberglass to a lot more of a structured work for the next albums. Twilight and Thunderstorms is the middle child of the Barriers trilogy, as it was. And I think it sort of suffers from that syndrome of middle child and being sort of viewed as in between. I still think it's the second best. Maybe it's just because of my personal view that Inserenity and Infernos was a complete letdown, and I'll get more into why I think that later. But I think this album is also interesting. I wouldn't say it's better per se. I might be a bit worse than Inserenity and Infernos, but in my opinion, it is still better. I like it better. Again, the more structured theme kind of did it well in some places, like with the very episodic Empty Desolation. It worked perfectly there. It was sort of like telling this story in different parts of the story, and I really like that. But then you get to like other parts where it tried to be structured but sort of didn't work, like Eating an Abandoned Food Court. You have this main drone kind of over everything, very reminiscent to Fiberglass, but it just didn't work here. Like a lot of the sort of routes I took in this album that worked in Fiberglass didn't work here. And I feel like it's kind of like you say a joke for the first time and everyone laughs and they think and you think it's great, you think it's great. But then like once you try to repeat it again, it's just not the same and it's very different, and you kind of like, oh hey, this worked before, why doesn't it work now? Well, it doesn't work now because you're trying to force it. I feel like Twilight Thunderstorms is a bit forced in places, very tacky. You could just take a look at the album art, especially on the track art for Twilight and Thunderstorms, and A Time Long Since Past, and you see it's very literally connected to the music. Like, the story was very literal to the music, and I feel like that kind of hurt it. It restricted it a lot. There isn't much else to say other than my high praise for the penultimate song, It's So Dark Here. It's almost perfect. It takes the style of Fiberglass with the multi-layered voice drone. It doesn't take multiple speeds, it just takes one speed and stacks voices on it. This style, almost as if a callback to Fiberglass, is very interesting here, and it kind of works for the first time in the album. It doesn't work elsewhere as much as it does here, except for maybe in World Below. That drone's very nice, but that's more of like a direct callback. While here it's like a completely different sound, and I think it works. And then you get to the second and third section, and maybe I like it so much because it's heavily based on the empty soundscapes from Ever Within a Time's 6th stage. I think it just does it very well. It's not a very good representation of that sound if I was trying to recreate it, but on its own, I think it's just amazing, and it pulls a very empty style off well. And then the organ ending is just chef's kiss. I love those chimes, and then you just end this nice piano piece to the album. Some people might not like that decision to end every album the same way, but I kind of like that decision. It's sort of like a nice end, like someone's playing you out as you walk out of the venue. Speaking of playing you out of a venue, the ending to the Barriers trilogy, the album which is the culmination of what was 6 months of work at that point, as well as work on some other adjacent albums, and then obviously everything that came before Barriers, was a letdown in my opinion. I think this sound is just very muddy. Like, it takes layering speeds multiple times, which was done in the third section, or third act, I like to call it, of It's So Dark Here, to great effect there because the organ sounds heavenly there. But everywhere else it was tried, it just does not sound good, just doesn't pull it off as good as it was done in Twilight and Thunderstorms. As I said earlier, it's sort of like the joke that worked well the first time, but just you tell it again and it's not funny, and then you keep trying it doesn't ever work. Maybe a couple times it worked here, but that sound, which sort of plagues the album, I just don't like it, and I think it never worked. The album started off well with the title track. I think it was a very nice start. It's definitely more fresh, more vibrant sounding than before, and I actually like that. It's a good starter, but then everything just kind of fell off, I think. I feel like I tried too hard to tie everything to the story, and I got very literal again, like especially with Shattering Sky, the drum hit representing the sky falling down and whatever, all that jazz, and the spooky choir playing you out. That idea was also done in Mental Collapse, which I'll talk about later, and I just don't like it. It feels too cheap, and it feels like such an obvious callback to Ever Within a Time. I just don't like it. I thought it was good at the time, but I've just grown to not like that decision, and that's kind of one of the reasons I don't like this album. A lot of decisions were kind of poor. Like, again, trying way too hard to tie these stories to the music. Although the one thing I can praise about this album is that the writing was great. I think compared to the other albums in the Barriers trilogy and other story albums, this album was written a lot better. Like, if I was ranking the album just on like how it relates to the story, or just the story and the writing, I think it's great. Like, I honestly think it's amazing, even though some of the stories are like the same, and they also tie like directly to the previous two Barriers albums and then other albums. Like part 3, or I should say part 10 of Inserenity and Infernos ties directly to the Roar of a Distant Storm, and then 9 ties directly to Mental Collapse, Nervous Breakdown. Like, they stop and start. But then from the music standpoint, from the music itself, it's just not interesting. Like, it's very boring, and a lot of it's the same sound which was done in Fiberglass and Twilight, just repeated again. It didn't really go into its new direction. Well, in some places it did, and I really like those areas where it did branch out, and I really like the parts where it calls back to everything before. Like, this album pulled from previous work. Like, that wasn't really done in Fiberglass and Twilight, save for a few areas. But it was done a lot here, and I kind of like that. It's tying everything together. But again, from a musical standpoint, it's not that interesting, and that kind of does not save it. But what I do think kind of saves the album is its fourth part, 12th part, whatever. That part is amazing, and I think it's probably the best part of the album by far, maybe compared to some parts, because it's so interesting. Sure, the first track borrows the same main style, and I kind of wish I didn't do that for the most part, but then it devolves into chaos, and it's just this sick soundscape of all these noises coming at you. And again, calling back to previous albums, I love it, I dig it. I wish it could have been mastered a bit differently, but that's my personal opinion. I still love how chaotic it is, even though it is a bit muted than it could have been. And the last two tracks I adore as well. Again, more callbacks to the previous album, like the organ being penultimate callback to Fiberglass, and then again the nice piano piece being like the others. They all sort of have a similar middle song and then last song. They all have similarities. And I think this album, on paper, it's an amazing end. Like, it was a great, perfect ending. But from a musical standpoint, it's a letdown. And I kind of hope that I don't let myself down like that again. Anyways, to continue, we are moving on to the Extras album. There isn't much to say on the sort of sound or background behind Solar Eclipse and March Evening, because it was an Extras album, and it's the extras aren't that good. You can kind of see why they're removed, because they weren't that good on their own, and so they were obviously used. Like, a lot of them are used in Empty Desolation, and some of them were used in other tracks, but yeah, not good on its own as a musical standpoint. But yeah, Extras album makes sense, or at least it started as an Extras album. It was released as a sort of cut of the best 13 from Exercises and Ambience, which I will talk about later. While Exercises and Ambience was being worked on, I added stories, I went back and added stories, and I went back and added track art, and I feel like that adds a bit more depth to an album which was already kind of bland. And while I'm here, I might as well also talk about The End of Days, the single. I love this single. Maybe I just have an attachment to the songs I wrote myself, but it's so simple and I just really like it. It's a nice song and it doesn't have a story at all. It's completely up to interpretation, and I think that's my favorite part about it. It's like the only part of this album where you can really form your own choices. Like, everything else, there's a story, and all you can interpret is what happens next or what that story means. But here, you make the story, and that's kind of why I love it. The next category are the Barriers adjacent story albums. So, story albums which aren't in Barriers, of which there are 4. But one of those I'm going to talk about in the modern albums, because it is one of those. And then the other one is also a modern album, so it's heard tonight. But 1 is not finished, and 2, it's also going through a lot of changes, which I'm not going to spoil yet, but it's definitely changing, and I kind of don't exactly have much to speak on it now. Anyways, the album I will talk about first is The Roar of a Distant Storm, which took one story particularly from Barriers, particularly Fiberglass and Flowers. That is the story of Gemini and Zani, and it sort of spreads it out on its own album. The album's rather short, and it consists of piano recordings and some of my own recordings, which admittedly kind of suck, except for maybe like 1 or 2 of them, which are kind of decent. Overall, this album is bad, although it does have a unique sound, which is interesting, that owes to most of the samples coming from the same source. It's a very unique sounding album, and some of the sounds are kind of nice, and I kind of love stuff like Reunited. But overall, as an album, it's kind of boring. It just gets boring over time. because like the tracks loop often. A lot of the loops are very short because the tracks aren't even slowed down that much. So you're hearing the same thing a lot. And although the breaks are nice, they don't break it enough. The only instrument is the piano, and obviously the vinyl crackle, which is present in all the old recordings. But yeah, there's just not enough differences to make it interesting, so it's just boring. And also, it wasn't really that good because, again, not much experience. Some of the tracks kind of sound like shit. But yeah, there isn't much at all to say about that album. So I'll move right on to Mental Collapse, Nervous Breakdown, where there is more to say. Mental Collapse, Nervous Breakdown is a chaotic cacophony of noise, and I kinda love it. Its story continues that of this unnamed character who we've been following parts 1, 4, and 9 of Barriers. We never learn this character's name, and that was kind of intentional so you don't get too attached to them when they fucking die horribly in this album. Basically what happens is that they were the one to witness what was sort of like the rapture, and to explain it, it's basically realities merging together. And obviously people aren't supposed to see that, they're all supposed to be like unconscious when it happens. But this guy managed to see it. And so he became a guide for those who were victorious in this battle. Again, this all ties to my book, so obviously he's very complicated and kind of not fully drawn out yet, but whatever. So this guy is sort of torn apart with the memories of these lives and these stories and all the moments that happened up to this, like those victorious and those who died. Mortals such as himself wouldn't be able to handle all of this information coming at him, so he slowly dies, and a part of his soul becomes this guide for these heroes, and the rest of him is just left to wander each place between realities. And that's kind of all that really happens. It's just a story of this man dying. And that's really all there is to the story. But the sound, I think, is really good. It's kind of muddy in places, kind of like what Inserenity Infernos is like, where there's too much speeds happening at once, too much sound, so it becomes muddy. But some parts are nice. Some parts are really interesting texture, good cacophony of noise. There's lots of stuff going on, stereo action. A lot of techniques which are used in the previous albums come back here, and they're used to good effect here. In some places, good effect. In some places, bad effect. Like in some places, it's just boring, and maybe the textures just sound merged too much, or maybe there's just too much going on, or maybe there's just not enough going on. This album is very rough around the edges, and I'm fairly confident I could do it better. It's just that it was rushed, because the way production was, is that I didn't have enough time to work on this album. I hadn't really started it sooner, so again, that's kind of on me for one, not working on it sooner, but also making the deadline way too short. Just like what happened with Aurora of a Distant Storm, the deadline had to make sense of story purposes, because it has to be story purposes, so it has to be released on this day. And I think that's kind of stupid, even though I did again with Where the Wind Blows Through You. But duties are limiting. I hate them. I'll never do them again. And I learned that multiple times with all these albums. That's all there really is to say about this album. I'm kind of split on it. I don't exactly know what to think about it. I think it's alright though. I think sound-wise it's interesting, but it just didn't go enough because there wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough time to really look back on the tracks. Some tracks I had like a couple times. I never really went far back, except for adding one thing to one track, which was just the same thing for 14 minutes, but is meant to make you go insane. Ooh, spooky, spooky. But yeah, I think this album is kind of weak. That's all there is to say about it. Finally, we're at the good stuff, the modern albums, the second last category I will be going over. In probably spending the most time praising it. The modern albums are the newest group of albums that I've created, and they stem from this new era, which happened after the release of Inserenity Infernos, where off the heels of this letdown of an album, I sort of took time to think of what the hell I was going to do next, because I can't just have this soar on my plate and that be the last thing I do. So I have to think of what to do after it, what to make better. I have to make a good next album so people don't think that I've just completely fallen off. And I think the first modern album, which I will talk about right now, Exercise in Ambience, was a great start. So this album was a challenge. I wanted to see if I could make one song every day for 40 days and make it interesting. And at first it was kind of like a funsy thing. I was like, oh, I wasn't sure if I was going to do this really. But then I started getting serious, and I actually did it. And it worked out well. And I never realized how well it could work out if you just make one track every day and just make it as interesting as possible, do new things, experiment. It's exactly what I was doing with Fiberglass and Flowers, and I never realized it until looking back and making this video that it was just the same thing. I just wasn't doing it. Or the other albums, I just completely skipped out on this new form of experimentation, trying to take what I've done and amplify it, do new things with these songs. I tried to use stuff I hadn't used before, although I kind of couldn't help myself in some places. Although some of these tracks are just beautiful, like Twilight Hall, it's probably my favorite on the album. It's just an amazing blend of sound. Obviously, its inspiration is kind of clear, but I think it works well as its own thing, like own separate thing. A lot of these other songs are kind of clearly influenced from other places, but they work well on their own. Again, there are some stinkers on this album. That's kind of inevitable when you have 50 tracks. But yeah, again, the 50 tracks things is because there were some alternates. I made a couple of extra things because why not? I didn't want to limit myself for this album. I guess technically there was a due date, but that was just the end of the challenge, and it worked. And so I decided to take this idea of one song every day, or at least trying to experiment as much as possible, and sort of working with all these ideas and trying to generate newer and newer ideas and experimenting with the next album, Where the Wind Blows Through You. If the way I talked the last album wasn't clear to how much I love it, then I guess I could just go ahead and say it right now that this is probably my favorite album which I've released so far, Where the Wind Blows Through You. It's amazing, and I think a lot of that owes to the experimentation which I did for this album. I made a total of 68 tracks. I know it's one off from the funny number, but 68 tracks, a good chunk of those are original, like the first and last, Frost, Cherry, and Home. Even the original works that are improvisations, I think, are really good. And again, a lot of the other completely original works, which go ahead and sample like synths and piano recordings and field recordings, a lot of that ties to my work on Milwaukee Protocol, where field recordings was definitely a big part of it. And I think that was a great help to me on this album because it helped me nail the mood of the second half of the album. This album was sort of split into two parts in my head. You have the first part, which is very calm and cheery, but then it devolves as you go on this journey through an empty, hollow winter wonderland, in heavy air quotes, that just seems to devolve and get more and more horrifying as you go on this journey. And then eventually you're lost and you hear birds, and I really love that detail. It gives an area, it gives depth to these songs. It's not like, oh, they're just playing in your head. They're playing in your head in this space. It makes it feel like a real space. And I love that detail. And I won't stop using field recordings. They're gonna appear on my next work and the next work after that. This is another change which is gonna stick with me. A lot of things which happen on this album are gonna stick with me. Original work, that's definitely gonna happen more. A lot of the ideas which were represented in this album, just amazing. Again, some of the ideas and songs were not very good. They didn't fit the vibe, but they were good. But what can you do? I think my selection, 14 tracks I chose for the final release, were good. Again, it was such a hard choice because I made so many great works for this album, but I felt like my choices were justified. Two songs which I knew I had to choose were The City Behind the Trees and Town Square After Dark. Name a more iconic duo. These two songs go hand in hand, and I love them both. I think they work perfectly one after the other. They're like that in the deluxe edition too, where all the tracks are there. I just love these songs, and I just can't get over how well this album worked. It started as such a simple pitch, like, oh, it's Christmas but you're all alone, and I think I nailed it. There was a story in mind, but I didn't take it too hard, and I think that definitely worked in my favor. All the experimentation from exercise and ambience, a good story which is kind of in the background, even less so than it was in Fiberglass and Flowers and other albums. Well, maybe not other albums before Fiberglass and Flowers, but it's definitely a background story. And I think it works great here. I think everything works great here. I don't have a single bad thing to say about this album. I love it. And then we have our final category, the original music stuffs. This is our last category, and I'll just be going over it very quickly. I even made a separate Bandcamp just to host my original recordings, just so it's separate, like completely original, like I recorded everything. Some of it's computerized stuff, some of it's field recordings, some of it's piano recordings, some of it's synth recordings, and all this stuff was, I guess, used in other places, or these ideas were used in other places. Some stuff was directly sampled, and some stuff was not sampled at all, but yeah. I think these albums are very important to note, and I like them. Maybe because they're original music, but it's definitely a good foot in the door for my music career going forward, and that's the importance of it. I want to move more into my own style. I don't want to keep going the way it was before. I'm moving. And I know some people have said some of my newer stuff isn't my style, but I don't really have a set style. My style is always changing. Even in one album, take Fiberglass and Flowers, for example. The stuff that was developed towards the end of the album has a completely different style than what was developed at the beginning, or even stuff developed around the same time. It's completely different. And I think that's the beauty of making music, and that's my favorite part about making music, just experimenting, doing whatever I want. Music is my hobby, it's my passion, and I just love doing it, and I do what I want. And I don't really stick to one idea or one train of thought. I just kind of keep going, and I take feedback. I see where I went wrong. For example, off the heels of Inserenity Infernos, I was that shit was ass, so I decided I'm going to change my ways, and so I changed, and everything just seems to be going up, and I hope that it continues to go up. That's really all there is to say for this video, I guess. I was going to do a ranking, but look at this video, it's 40 fucking minutes long, so I am probably going to do a ranking later. Maybe in a different video, which will hopefully be coming out soon. Also, another thing I wanted to say is to get sappy. I wanted to thank the people who have stuck with my music, people who listen to it. Like, I know not a lot of people care about it. I see the view counts. I don't get that many people talking about my music. Like, there's only a couple people, and shout out to them. They're very cool. And I'm glad they enjoy my music, and I'm glad they give me feedback. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys. I want to thank you guys for sticking through this. It's been a wild year, and I'm looking forward to another wild year. As I record this, Rapidly Fading Legacy turned 1 year old 3 days ago. And this video is probably released around the 11th of January 2023, which is 1 year after the title track Fiberglass and Flowers was released on my YouTube channel /made. So a big day in my music timeline, I guess. A big day for me, and it just kind of started from there, and everything just kind of fell in place. Crazy year, whatever, yeah. Anyways, that's it. See you, bye.